Larry, what the hell are you
Larry!
Larry, you can't just... Oh,
Larry! Oh, are you all right? How did you...
Larry!
Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. You're looking at one of my most recent PSA submissions, and as you can see, there are a ton of PSA 8s included here. Now, near mint to mint grade is not the most desirable grade out there from PSA for these types of vintage cards, and these are mostly mint-looking cards after all. And I've seen a lot of other users have similar experiences and rush to judgment concluding that PSA must have changed their grading standards. Now, this population control theory is very prevalent on the internet, and it does raise some interesting questions. Is PSA actively withholding Gem Mint 10s for vintage cards such as these? Today, I wanted to break down 3 key distinctions and nuances to grading that I think a lot of people are unaware of. First, when having these discussions about the nuances of grading, it's important to delineate modern cards from vintage cards, which each suffer from their own unique conditional issues. Second, we need to differentiate between different grading companies, because different companies have different conditional standards and calculation systems for applying those standards. Finally, we'll address the population control argument. Is this the end of Gem Mint 10s for vintage, or is there something else that could explain this phenomenon? And before we roll into each of these points, I wanted to throw out this disclaimer that these are just my experiences with grading, and I welcome all of your opinions and experiences as well down in the comments below. I have a feeling this video is going to make some people angry or upset, but what do you do? Anyway, let's roll into our first distinction. Now, the first distinction that needs to be made when addressing the population control theory is the difference between modern cards and vintage cards, because each of these types of Pokemon cards come from their own different era, and as a result, they're going to suffer from their own unique conditional issues. Over the years, there's been an inconsistency in card design, in production process, and even quality control, and naturally that's going to manifest itself in how those cards are presented, what types of condition they're in, and what graders are looking for. Now, it's no secret out there that with PSA, modern cards have extremely high gem rates. Most of them anyway, especially in comparison to vintage cards that have much lower gem rates, and some are extremely low. I have some data that I wanted to share with you, breaking down 2 of the most popular Pokemon out there, Umbreon and Charizard. As you can see from the on-screen graphic, a modern card like the Umbreon VMAX from Evolving Skies has a significantly higher population than the original Moonbreon, the OG Moonbreon, from Neo Discovery. This one in first edition only has a population of 100 compared to the over 14,000 from Evolving Skies. Now, when you break it down for the total amount that were actually submitted for grading, the gem rate is also starkly in contrast to each other, with the Umbreon from Neo Discovery at an 8.1% gem rate, which is pretty average for other holographic cards in that set, versus the 74.8% gem rate for the Evolving Skies Umbreon. Now, I'll fully admit that these examples are anecdotal, but if we turn our attention to another one, Charizard, looking at the Celebrations Charizard from 2020 versus the original Charizard from base set, again, we have a significant difference in population, with the original Charizard having 485 copies in a PSA 10 versus the Celebrations Charizard at 22,440. The gem rate is astronomically low for the Charizard from base set at just 0.7%. That's not even 1% of the population, versus the 64.3% of Celebrations Charizards. Now, is this evidence of population control, or are there other underlying reasons for this? That's the tricky part. I think this distinction between modern and vintage makes sense when taking into account 2 factors that are actively working against vintage cards: time and technology. We see that over time, vintage cards have had much more exposure to the elements and more opportunity for deterioration, especially when factored in with card storage, which wasn't as commonplace back then, and it certainly wasn't to the same etiquette that it is today. Manufacturing has also improved as it's been streamlined and the process has been perfected, and there's been more emphasis on quality control. Now, obviously, that's not the case with every single manufacturing run or every single product that's produced, but just in general, as time passes, there's going to be more advancements in that sort of technology. It's also worth mentioning card culture. Back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, there wasn't an emphasis on collecting cards for investment purposes, and so people were less concerned about the condition of their cards, whereas today it's very commonplace to immediately have cards graded, to keep them sleeved and bindered, to have them stored in top loaders or card savers. People are much more protective of their cardboard investments now than they were back in those days. And to play devil's advocate for a moment, if we go back to our Charizard graphic and substitute out the Celebrations Charizard with another modernish Charizard, the Evolutions Charizard from 2016, it's shockingly similar in population to the base set Charizard. Now, the Evolutions Charizard only has a population of 555 in PSA 10 out of a total population of over 40,000 graded with a gem rate of just 1.4%, which is absurdly low. And I think what helps explain this is having historical context in mind, that Evolutions came out following the popular Pokemon Go craze, and products couldn't keep up with demand, so this was a set that was marked with a lot of production issues and very poor quality control. So it's not just vintage cards, it also extends to modern in certain situations. But I think that's one of the primary problems out there is people that have extensive experience grading modern that assume that different eras of cards like vintage are conditionally equivalent. And to me, that's just naive and contributes to the card grading misinformation and conspiracy theories that are running rampant out there in the community. A second important distinction that needs to be made is that different grading companies have different conditional standards. And one of the first differences between these companies is that each has its own unique grading scale. And although they are similar in 10-point numerical system, they aren't interchangeable. For example, Beckett has 3 different Gem Mint grades available: their Black Label 10, their Pristine 10, and their Gem Mint 9.5. CGC, on the other hand, has 2 10 grades, a Pristine 10 versus a Gem Mint 10. They also have a 9.5 that's a Mint Plus, whereas PSA only has 1 10 grade. So the threshold for what constitutes a 10 is different with each one of these companies. This leads us to a second important distinction: how companies actually calculate their scores. Now, every one of these companies is using the same 4 grading criteria: surface, centering, corners, and edges, but whether they take an average of these 4 subgrades or utilize the lowest subgrade for their overall scores is where they differ. Traditionally, CGC and Beckett have taken an average of these scores to warrant their overall score, whereas PSA has taken the lowest score as their final grade. It's not uncommon for a card from PSA to have a small indent on it or surface scratching to receive a 5 or a 6 on their grading scale, despite having potentially perfect corners, perfect centering, and perfect edges. That's just the way they grade. I've made an entirely separate video on this topic, which I'll leave linked down in the description below, but there's even differing priorities between different grading companies. PSA is notorious for counting factory-issued print lines as one of their main conditional issues that they look for, whereas CGC is extremely harsh on front edge silvering that often happens from just having dull blades at the time that cards were cut. For example, if we take a set that is notorious for print lines like Neo Genesis, you'll find that the gem rates are significantly lower for PSA than they are for CGC, sometimes to a factor of over 10-fold. And it's not just this particular set, it's all of the different cards out there that have that light holofoil background that are susceptible for print lines. Almost across the board, they're getting hammered by PSA. On the other hand, if we take a set that's notorious for front edge silvering like Neo Destiny, suddenly the roles are inverted, with CGC being extremely harsh on this type of wear, and PSA seemingly unconcerned, treating it as though it was just part of the manufacturing process. As you can see, the CGC Gem Mint rates are significantly lower. This is just one of the nuances that you discover as you've gained more experience grading. So once more, I think one of the contributing issues out there is that people who have limited experience grading assume that grading companies are all the same. And not only is that naive, but it also contributes to the card grading misinformation and conspiracy theories that we're addressing here in this video. Finally, let's address the population control argument by first revisiting my PSA submission from earlier. There's a lot of minty-looking PSA 8s here in this pile, and this leads one to conclude one of 2 things. Either PSA has changed their standards, or PSA is actively suppressing populations, not willing to give out those Gem Mint grades. However, I do think there's a third option present, that these cards weren't mint cards. At least, not Gem Mint cards. The truth is that none of these cards were Gem Mint candidates to begin with. During my pre-grading process, I had most of these cards listed as 8s, with maybe some with the potential of 9s. And that's because I've been grading for so long that many of my Gem Mint-worthy candidates have already been processed and sent in for grading. So we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel here. I do think that many of these are fair grades. They may have been a little bit harsh, and there's always a room for a little bit of subjectivity from grader to grader, from submission to submission, but it's definitely not a population control issue at work here. In fact, I think the population control argument is silly for a number of reasons, which we'll get into here in just a second. But I think the population control issue can be more logically explained in this manner. higher value cards are going to warrant greater time and attention, more scrutiny. I think this makes sense from PSA due to their financial implications. They have a money-back guarantee. There's also reputational concerns that there's going to be negative publicity for misgrades, so they are incentivized to look over high-value cards very carefully, both for the grader as well as for the company. And I think it's fair to say that with a more thorough inspection, it's going to reveal more flaws and imperfections. Now, one could make the counter-argument that this is how PSA should be treating every card that comes into contact with, but it's just not a reality with the volume that they bring into their company on a daily basis to be that thorough with every single card. Perhaps they should be. They definitely are with the higher value ones, maybe not so much with some of the lower value cards. If I could offer a personal analogy, I've been an English teacher for over 14 years, grading tens of thousands of papers over that span. Some of these papers have only required a quick scan. We're talking daily assignments where I'm looking at content and evidence of students' understandings of the concepts. However, if we take it up a notch to essays, then I'm going to give it a more thorough assessment. I'll be looking at things like organization, reasoning, redundancy, grammar, and mechanics. But if we even elevate it one step up from there with a college application essay, well, then I'm taking a comprehensive review. I'm looking at the style and diction that students use to craft their own individual voice within their writing. I'm looking at sentence variety created with punctuation like commas, colons, and semicolons. I'm even looking at things like parallelism and how they can create the most efficient and effective flow for their writing. I think what it comes down to is the level of scrutiny and nuance required is situational. I can always find flaws and shortcomings in students' writing, but it's largely time dependent. The same is true with card grading. PSA isn't officially suppressing populations, rather they're scrutinizing higher value cards more thoroughly because the stakes are higher, both for the individual grader and also for the company as a whole. To cap off my argument with some data, I wanted to return back to our two earlier vintage cards, the Charizard from base set and the Umbreon from Neo Discovery. Although both of these cards have very low populations, those populations are still growing. The Charizard was originally at 448 PSA 10 copies back in March of 2022, which have grown to 485 PSA 10 copies. Meanwhile, over that same time span, Umbreon has increased from 87 PSA 10s to 100 PSA 10s. This is a near linear rate of growth and is in line with what those cards have previously done. So here are my final thoughts about population control. First, I don't really see a motive for this. Why would PSA want to suppress PSA 10s? What would they gain from it? Also, why would they focus on so many unpopular cards? Many of the lowest population cards out there are not popular species of Pokemon, and it just seems like an odd choice to focus on those ones. Secondly, it's really not supported by the data. Population reports are still increasing, and they're increasing at a rate that is consistent with how they've increased in the past. Finally, I think the population control argument ignores a lot of the nuance that goes into card grading. It assumes that there's an equivalency between modern cards and vintage cards, which isn't always the case, and it also assumes that equivalency between the different grading companies and how they actually assess cards, which, as we've seen with the data, also isn't the case. Anyway, guys, like I said, I welcome your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think PSA is actively suppressing gem mint grades, or do you think some of these other nuances help explain the situation with vintage cards and some of those higher value items going through PSA grading? That's going to wrap it up for this one. I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you all that the classics never go out of style. We'll catch you all with the next one. Till then, stay well, everybody, and don't forget to have fun. That's what this is all about. Bye, everybody.